You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. I am your host, Danny Ashes, and I'm here with my co-host, Trey. Our guest this episode is the incomparable Shonalika. You may have seen their recent video on YouTube titled Goth is White, Pallor, Prejudice, and Purity, which, as they put it, was an exploration of racism, colorism, appropriation, and flirting with fascism in the goth scene. But they are also one half of the synth-pop band Powderpaint, a musician in their own right, as you can see with their new absolute club banger, Pally Penny, which you can also find on their YouTube channel under Shonalika. And you can find them on the Sci-Fi Book Club podcast, Calendrical Rot. I'm a huge fan of their video essays, and I'm really excited to pull apart and digest the contents of their most recent aforementioned video. So in this episode, we are going to explore goth's white hegemony, racism, gatekeeping, and identity. We'll be looking at the ways the mechanisms of white supremacy have showed up in the goth scene, talk about what we can do about it, and we'll also be discussing whether goth is a music-based subculture or identity. I don't want to get any more detailed than that because I'm too excited to get into the conversation. So, if you don't mind, let's get to introductions. From my understanding, you have connected with goth in various ways over the years, but only recently started using the term to identify yourself. So can you kind of share with us what that process looked like for you?
I'm not sure if I specifically had tons of spooky leanings prior to a certain age. I do think the most obvious tipping over into that kind of aesthetic and kind of sensibility was just falling into the sort of rejects and emo crowd at school.
Yeah.
I think there were definitely like hints of it before that, like a lot of the art that my sister liked was very dark. Like she was very into Francis Bacon, age 10, and our parents were a bit disturbed. And I liked a lot of like spooky fiction, like for kids. So like the Lemony Snicket books were probably a big one for me. So there was definitely like leanings that way, but nothing so obvious. Honestly, I had no interest in music prior to a certain age, like none. I was forced to play the violin like many kids and hated every minute of it, and just had no interest in music whatsoever. And then I think the kids in school at that age, it was more of a kind of metal, hard rock kind of a group than goth, really. Yeah. But they share a lot of aesthetic similarities and a lot of lots of similarities in terms of sensibility. I think things definitely hit for me when I ended up going to a My Chemical Romance concert, which was my first concert ever, because one of my friends couldn't go. I wasn't even originally scheduled to go. Yeah, I ended up just getting his ticket, and I just went along not really knowing what to expect. And this was like height of Black Parade era. So they had this very, very slick, very well put together performance, which was incredible to see. Yeah. But I also really loved the playfulness of their performance. They one moment that stands out to me is somebody had like blown up a condom and thrown it on stage, and and then halfway through the set, Jared was like waving it around, going, "I didn't say it was my birthday," and just really engaging with the crowd, even though it was a big crowd, and rolling with what happened and bringing this real sense of like fun and playfulness to it. It wasn't all just serious. I think that turned me into a musician on the spot.
That's fantastic.
I love it.
Yeah, and then after that, I think when it comes to more goth stuff specifically, I think I used to be honestly I needed too much engagement from music to really get into goth music, because I find a lot of it to be kind of almost more about establishing a vibe and then sinking into the vibe, and I was too impatient for that at a certain age.
Yeah.
So I remember first coming across Sisters of Mercy like 10 years ago or so and thinking like, this is like, I almost am into this, but it's not doing enough. This is like the same riff. We're still on the same riff, and it's the chorus. And now I really vibe with that. So I think some of my, I guess almost like my energy has shifted. I have a lot more patience now and a lot more time, and I think that I can appreciate just sinking into a vibe in a way that I couldn't when I was younger.
Yeah, I can feel that. I know when I was younger too, I tried listening to like Virgin Prunes and Alien Sex Fiend and Bauhaus, and I was like, not really.
Yeah, exactly.
No,
where's the melody? It's not hooking me. Yeah.
But now, I love that shit. So it's just it's like an acquired taste kind of thing.
Very much.
Fantastic. Well, let me ask a little about your background in gender as well, because for me, I grew up as a conservative Christian, and I was very much in the sort of like not just that I believed there were only two genders, I didn't know there was a different framework for understanding gender. Probably until I was in like mid-20s probably, which is pretty late, but I was in quite a bubble. And goth, though, was a space for me that allowed me to experiment with androgyny before I had any idea what like a trans person was or what gender theory was. So I'm curious to hear a little about what your, I don't know how gender journey is a really cheesy way to say that, but you know, how did that happen for you, and how does do you see your goth identity informing your gender or vice versa?
Yeah, I think it's definitely related, but probably not in the same way as you, because of the role that assigned gender would play there. So because goth leans feminine, there is typically going to be less androgyny practiced if you do feminine and you're AFAB than if you do feminine and you're AMAB. Yeah. So it wouldn't have had as much of an effect on me in that particular way. However, I think I have felt a lot more comfortable dressing feminine within goth than I would have without goth, as an overarching aesthetic, because it kind of draws attention to other things besides the femininity, if you see what I mean. So I only started like really dressing in what would be recognized by other people as goth aesthetics within the last maybe 2 years, which does correlate with me getting top surgery and feeling more comfortable in my body. But one thing that I thought was really fascinating is in the last video that I did, I'm wearing quite a femme outfit in that, but a completely transparent top with nothing underneath it. And the number of people misgendering me in the comments or with reference to that video is quite remarkable. Yeah, and I don't really have an issue with this in the sense that like I'm not expecting validation from the wider world in terms of people they theming me, because it's that knowledge just isn't there for people yet. The social norm being say they until told otherwise is just not established enough in the wider world. So I'm not really, unless people already know my channel and they're doing it on purpose, which I don't think any of these people were, it's not malicious, and I'm not bothered by it. But I did find that fascinating, because I was like, that is a transparent top. You can see through it. There is nothing there. How are you, like, does that not suggest like an element of gender squiggly to you? And I think that the overall feminine presentation essentially overrides that in the same way that that very young children will frequently or not even very young children, but just or people in general, in fact, if they just haven't had a close enough look at someone, will frequently gender long-haired men as women, because the long hair signifies women, right? So there's no that was just fascinating to me from like a kind of just a social perspective in terms of what people thought they were seeing.
Yeah. Do you find that wearing more feminine clothing in a goth style is empowering in a way, because it feels like it's sort of still queering gender norms in a way, or is it just aesthetic?
No. I feel like it definitely ties in to gender. I'm much more comfortable presenting femme in a goth way, through a goth lens, than I would be otherwise. And I also enjoy getting like extremely androgynous with it, and just wearing like mesh tops and things like that. I will say it does having being extremely comfortable with my body now is the main factor rather than goth. I think I don't think I'd be able to do all of this if I hadn't had top surgery. Really, I don't think I'd be comfortable enough in my body. So the two things, goth does help, but I think the confidence comes first.
Yeah, I can understand that. Yeah, I think it's just interesting to me, because it is, and you know, to your point, androgyny and gender play is far more on the AMAP side of things, but even to the point of this sort of ubiquity of that within goth, I think about 2001 was when I started getting into goth, and I was in a Christian bubble, and so my first community were Christian goths, and they were like conservative Christian goths, so they were still on board with all of the sort of tenets of conservative Christianity. But what blew my mind at the time was that there were men wearing skirts and makeup, and the first ever conversation I had with a gay person was in that group. And I remember a pastor trying to explain why that was okay within the bounds of the Christian theology, as this idea of like men only traditionally wear pants because there was a big horse riding culture in America or something like that. So it was this sort of like concept
by a little bit, but that's fine.
Yeah, but it was the concept of like gender being socially constructed, even though that wasn't what he wanted to argue, was such a strange thing. But, you know, for me, it was like, it felt comfortable without, because I didn't know I was genderqueer, but it was a safe space to express that in a way that was acceptable, I guess.
Yeah, 100%. No, it's wonderful for that. I really appreciate that about it. And yeah, when it comes to, in my particular case, dressing more feminine, I think the dressing in a way that is going to put a lot of people off, because they find it gross or weird or whatever, definitely adds to the freedom of expression in that for me.
Yeah, there's something about the kind of, I guess, power dynamic when you are expressing those sort of, sartorial signifiers that are, like when I wear my patch jackets or something that have sort of like working class and like Marxist like messages and various things, like queer philosophy things on there. There's something empowering about being in a public space without having to say anything, but still sort of providing a space of like, this is possible. This is a way that we can exist. And knowing that it makes other people uncomfortable in some ways gives me some reassurance that perhaps it will have some impact down the line, but through sort of exposure. For sure. But anyway, that's not the primary thing I wanted to talk about today. You recently put out a video called Goth is White, Pallor, Prejudice, and Purity. And you cover a lot of ground in that video, but that sort of cluster of subjects is what I wanted to mostly focus on today. And I think a lot of people, especially in America now, are sort of thinking about and living through a kind of rise in fascism. It's not just in America. Obviously, white supremacy is kind of on the rise around the world.
Yeah.
But, a lot of us are thinking about these things, are angry, are suffering, whatever. And so that, I think, is even more relevant of a topic now. But I guess one of the places I wanted to start was sort of asking how or what ways you find that goth speaks to the experience of racialized people.
I think a lot of it is very similar to the reasons that misfits and outcasts like gravitate towards goth anyway. There's a very high trans population, there's a very high queer percentage. I've seen a lot of disabled people in goth spaces as well.
Same, yeah.
Really cool. And I think anyone who is outcast by society in any way or othered in any way is quite likely to find relief in goth, because it's this place, or it's meant to be this place where you can where those things don't matter as much. So that's definitely one aspect of it. But the other aspect that's more specific to racialized folk is the focus on pain and on suffering. Because, and to be fair, that's also there in like the trans experience and things as well. It's not like it's not like it isn't. But a lot of the racialized experience, especially, I kind of touched on this in the video a bit, but people with who are descended from violence, basically, and who exist in Western countries as the result of the colonization of their countries of origin. It has huge significance there as a way to process some of that harm that's been done ancestrally and continues to be done just on the reg, and
just casually,
yeah. And on top of that, there's also the potential for this is a bit weird, honestly, because it comes at a weird intersection of like goth has a tendency to sort of fetishize the other and the exotic, and to pull from a lot of racialized cultures, which on one hand is like not great, but on the other hand it's like, oh well, but we belong here, this is our stuff. So it kind of, there's this strange sort of line being walked where it's like we're sort of theoretically more welcome here because it's like, well, you like our stuff.
Yeah.
But then often that doesn't actually translate in practice, which is...
But we like your stuff superficially and don't understand the actual core meanings oftentimes.
Yeah, exactly.
Or the context they come from, yeah.
But honestly, I think speaking for myself and for like a lot of people who have quite severed connections to their countries of origin, which is very much the case with me, that vagueness is appealing because it doesn't require you to be especially connected to any of the things. It presents a space where you can loosely be connected to some of those ideas, even if the root of that connection has been lost. And just in general, goth provides this space, this kind of other culture for those of us who've lost the ones that we would have maybe grown up with under other circumstances. So it's hugely important on so many counts to goths of color, but it's not a subculture that there are that many of us in, for all the reasons that I went into in the video.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like it's kind of an idea that it's almost goth spaces are creating their own unique culture, but it has enough of these touchstones that are comforting from your background in the source culture, without necessarily all the baggage that comes with needing to integrate with that source culture in a way that if you were just in a true cultural space would have, because they have all those expectations of, no, you're part of this culture and you have to be this, and this. You can just sort of enjoy the comfort of seeing those touch points while still being able to express your uniqueness without the constrictures of greater culture.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think another aspect of it that occurred to me just now is that is that the vagueness speaks to the displacement. So it's kind of a reflection of our lived experience that we don't have that really deep connection with it, and it's kind of scattered and it's kind of superficial and it's kind of just there in the aesthetic sometimes, or it's just kind of vaguely called to in some way without necessarily being deeply embodied in the same way that it would be had you grown up with it. And I think that is part of Goth's appeal.
I don't know if this also tracks with that for you, but sort of one of the frameworks I've taken a liking to is the idea of like the uncanny. The way I understand it is making strange social conventions through artifice or camp or
recontextualization,
melancholy. Creating a sort of unnerving, odd sort of feeling of familiarity with that's been tweaked in a way.
No, I think that's definitely what I'm getting at. It's like it looks disjointed and it feels disjointed because that's what has happened, and in some ways that has a lot more meaning to people who may have been connected to those symbols once, rather than I guess most of the white folk who are just kind of like, yeah, this looks cool. You know.
Well, let's sort of explore that side of things a little bit, because on the other side of that, I think in a lot of ways, goth is white coded and kind of affords some freedoms to white goths that racialized goths don't get. So can you share sort of how you see that side of things occurring in the goth scene?
Yeah, so a lot of this I've talked about in the video. The focus on palo probably being the central aspect of it, in that goth very much venerates palo, which is very, very closely linked to whiteness. It's not exclusive to whiteness, but it's very closely linked to it. And in the doing of that, I think what a lot of white goths don't realize is that they are upholding white standards and upholding essentially whiteness. And because of I'd say what whiteness isn't the only, or pallor isn't the only like quality that makes a very sort of stereotypically desirable goth. I think other things like being tall, being androgynous, being skinny, these things are all going to all contribute towards the sort of gothic archetype. And I think that because there is this veneration of people who look a certain way, one thing that I've really noticed is that white goths, especially white goths who have more of those characteristics, can get given opportunities on the basis of doing literally nothing. It's just kind of
yeah, you have an automatic baseline social capital just because you were born a certain way.
Exactly. Yeah, it's very much assumed that, like, okay, well, you look this way, so you must be good at this thing. Whereas if you're a person of color, the idea that you even know anything about goth music is probably going to be like met with surprise. I think that white goths are able to build platforms faster as well, because obviously there's the specific issues that exist within the goth community, but there's also just white supremacy as a whole. So you have algorithms that bias pallor.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even without like the goth community actively uplifting it. So when you have both of those things working together, white goths can build platforms very rapidly and things like that in a way that people of color just can't. And I think this causes issues not just on a kind of broader systemic scale where this is all kind of passively just happening and nobody's kind of actively putting anyone down or whatever. This is just kind of the effects of the broader system and the subculture. But I do think the fact that that especially the white goths with the highest amount of social capital in that way, it gives them more opportunities to not do the work, basically. Because either on one hand they might have this sort of inflated sense of importance, because one thing that I love about the scene, and I might come back to this, is kind of how small it is, and is like, for example, I went to see an Ultrasun show, and those guys were just in the audience with us watching the support act.
Yeah,
like that was lovely. It's really like there's a lot less of this kind of putting on airs. And the members of the community tend to be just in it. Like also I went to see Echo Beryl, and then later one of the people from that band was doing the DJing for the club night later. So it's very like interconnected, and everyone's just kind of there, and there's a lot less of this kind of very distinct hierarchy that you might see in other communities, I guess. But the flip side of that is that you can be a very big fish in a very small pond very fast, and that, I think that can give people an over an inflated sense of importance very quickly. I think that the more social capital, the more gothic social capital you have, the less onus is on you to do work, because other people will just do things for you, so you will not realize the work that you're not doing. And there's a lot to it. There's incredibly there's more than I covered in that long video.
I've seen examples of that when dealing with abusers, especially. You have people who have that baseline level of social capital because they have a certain aesthetic or a certain look that's they're born with. It's not usually something they necessarily put a lot of craft into, but oftentimes there is some craft to it as well. But they become so ingrained in a community, they become such a fixture within the space, that any toxic behavior, whether it's manipulation or abuse of other members of the community, as long as the other members are lower status, it's oftentimes either willfully ignored or just glossed over as, hearsay. And so they retain their membership with the community, hindering its sense of being a safe space, just because people are unwilling to see this person who fits the ideal so well as a potential villain and a potential negative drag on the community itself.
Yeah, I couldn't have put it better. That's exactly. I've been thinking about that kind of thing a lot lately.
I hear a lot of people talking about like a lack of representation, and whether it's in clubs, like I've heard people talk about not necessarily feeling welcome because there's primarily white people in a certain space, or just like in on websites and magazines and things like that. But I think what's important for me is more the lack of ownership for racialized people, whether it's like club nights or businesses or that kind of thing, because I think ownership provides like a large degree of agency and influence in a community, and more autonomy, rather than like asking a white person who runs something to provide more representation or whatever. Even if they're well-meaning, they won't necessarily be able to create that influence. And I think upending that power dynamic is I actually probably influences the way goth is perceived and what goth is understood as well.
Theoretically, that would be fantastic, and just from my experience at being at clubs so far, one of the most diverse nights and one of the nights that I feel safest at is one of the very few which has a racialized person on the organizational team. But they are the only one, and it puts a lot of pressure on them to make that space better in that way. I mean, I say that like I don't know about this person specifically, but I would imagine that is the case. And the trouble is that years ago, speaking to other goths of color, we had this like little fantasy of like putting on an event ourselves where the entire organizational team is people of color, and it's a lovely idea, but we are all broken. The scene, I don't know a single racialized person who's also a goth who hasn't had a harrowing experience from a white goth. And like you're saying about sort of abusers in the space, this makes it very difficult. Not forget running events. It's hard to go sometimes because, I mean, I can think of at least 3 individuals whose where the issues range from like emotional abuse to like, I don't know how to put this, mild sexual assault, either towards me or towards brown people that I love. And these are people who are in the scene. They're in the spaces that we want to go to. And we have to do things like overcoming physical trauma responses to those individuals to even be in those scenes. Like that's the level of effort and work that we have to put in to overcome the interpersonal results of how white supremacy manifests in the goth scene. So running events is hard. Like I would love to. I would really love to, but like I think this is a responsibility that white people are going to need to take on more because they are the bulk of the scene. And we need to be given that leg up basically in order to be able to do this ourselves, because it's like on top of suffering the effects, we then also have to advocate for ourselves, and it's exhausting.
Oh yeah.
No, I definitely advocate for that. And I think that's just in general, for white people, just kind of part of, I guess, like personal reparations, or just sort of like how do I leverage the privilege that I have to give more to someone else, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically the framework of not being racist. It's more from the standpoint of someone as part of the white hegemony. Not being racist is not simply, oh, I don't use racial slurs and I don't directly oppress the people.
Yeah.
It is a matter of using that platform, using the privilege that you have been given to help platform others who do not get that privilege natively, because there has to be a leg up. There's not any sense in the American parlance of pulling oneself up by their bootstraps. It can't happen if there's nobody helping to platform those voices that already have those platforms. It's too much of a struggle, and that being an anti-racist is important rather than just not being a racist.
That's it. And I think recognizing what that looks like on an interpersonal level rather than just a theoretical one, because I think a lot of goths that I know are good at the theory, right? They're good at the like, well, I'm an anarchist or whatever. Exactly. Like I had a horrible experience, like a very, very deeply traumatic experience with a sort of archetypical white goth early this year, who was like, anarchist, vegan is the other like big one. That one's so easy, right? Because the animals aren't going to turn around and tell you you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
And, they spoke like they'd swallowed the multi-amory podcast, like all like, I was like, oh, this is great, this is good, this is fine, this is safe, and it was none of those things. And I think that when a lot of white goths will lay claim to a set of values that sound nice on paper, but then when those values are actually need to be put into practice, just suddenly find themselves incapable, and will often like fall back on like, my mental health is bad and stuff like that. And then the people of color are pretty much always put in this position of prioritizing that person's mental health. Like white mental health always comes at the honestly at the expense of the mental health of those that they are harming. And people of color are just expected to look after and prioritize that. And I found myself doing it early this year, and it's mad because that behavioral system is so ingrained that even if I don't intellectually agree with it, I will sometimes still practice that and still adhere to those systems without realizing that that's what I'm doing. And enforcing it myself, like we all do it. Yeah, no, it's very insidious, and it's very real. Like I remember discussing like some of the events that happened to me with a bunch of other brown goths, and being like, am I just making up that there was like a race element to this, or am I? And they were all like slamming their fists on the table, going, "No, there absolutely is a race element to this." And I was just sort of discussing the dynamics that can exist between like white Goths and brown Goths, and how we're pretty much expected to behave. And I was sort of struggling for the right word. I was sort of like, it's almost like we're expected to. And then one of the people that I was with sort of went to serve, and I was just like, shit, that's it. Good. That is what it is. I think there's a lot of conflation of passivity with the inability to cause harm. There's a lot of sort of almost like the idea that to show emotion or to be vulnerable is an inherent positive, because it's not the same as being aggressive, and therefore that is somehow good. And it's like, no, that's like a little bit better, but that can also be weaponized in an incredibly toxic way. And just being soft about the way you're being toxic doesn't mean you're not toxic.
Right.
Yeah.
I see that a lot with men who will kind of be abusive in their relationships with women and sort of like do something harmful, and then when they're called out on it, go right to, overly emotional responses to either like a self-harm thing, or like I'm overly apologetic kind of thing, forcing the person who was harmed to then swallow their experience and have to manage and sympathize with the person that hurt them. I've been seeing a lot of that recently too. Yeah,
it's a real issue. And I think I don't want to slag off Goth's propensity towards androgyny, because I love that, and that's wonderful, and it gives people so much freedom and so much it's part of the reason it's such a haven for queer folks. It's great, but it does sometimes that in and of itself can be weaponized in this weird way where it like falsely signifies safety. And it's like the aesthetic of femininity is not the same as taking on board the actual values of that. If you were to like very in a very sort of basic way contrast femininity and masculinity and take the values of femininity that forward, it's like, well, just having nice hair isn't and like being like, oh, I have feelings, it isn't being decent and good. That's like, actually sometimes you do need to stand up and you do need to be like, actually this isn't okay, I'm going to fix this, I'm going to change this. Being docile and kind of, just like wraith-like isn't an inherently positive quality.
Yeah.
Right. Being feminine is definitely not being a feminist.
No.
Yeah. I mean, I see a lot of that. I had a similar conversation recently, but just on the sort of lived up kind of side of things, where people think they are being a kind of defender against racism, but really are just sort of trying to self-validate and don't want to be called out on neoliberal ideals that they have that are actually harmful, but they think aren't, because they're in this sort of bubble about it. And one of the things that I loved that you talked about in your video was calling out the reflex among Goths to have that kind of holier than thou attitude, or the sort of hand waving of criticisms where we think we're more enlightened than, the quote unquote mainstream. So I don't know if you're interested in talking about sort of more about where you see that coming from, or this idea of like why it's harmful for Goths to sort of say, or white Goths specifically, to address racism by kind of just saying, well, Goth isn't racist because it's for everyone kind of thing.
Honestly, I'm not sure that Goth necessarily has. When I say Goth, I mean that's a very broad generalization, but you know what I mean. Just we are talking in general terms because one has to. I'm not sure that I necessarily think that Goth has an ethical sense of superiority to the mainstream necessarily, but there is a sense of superiority, and I think that can come from the idea that being alternative is inherently good. Or is inherently somehow superior. and by the kind of logic where like if something is mainstream then it's bad, if something is alternative then it's good, which I find so frustrating, because
you're in good company.
There's no value underlying it. It's like I think people can latch on to the idea of rebelliousness and transgression, and believe that being rebellious is therefore inherently valuable because it's rebellious, rather than because you're really engaging with what you're rebelling against and what the rebellion is standing for. And I think that's an issue with where goth has like drifted from its punk roots, in that there isn't necessarily a value system underlying the kind of holier than thou attitude of like, well, that's mainstream, and it's like, well, so what makes it bad? Do you know?
Yeah.
And that's what I find frustrating about it. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think it's I see a lot of this sort of what you're saying, in group, out group, and because we are the out group that was bullied in some way, and we have our own sort of community. Some people get this sort of like superiority complex, I think, about just well, I'm not like them, so I'm better than them, and that means that we're kind of obfuscating very real harm, whether it's sexism or racial bias, or just not acknowledging our own privilege, and having and feeling a empowerment to speak about things that some people don't have any real background in, like you're saying, no underlying value system or understanding from like racialized activists or educators, or understanding like the history of white supremacy and the ways that shows up in the world, and just kind of speaking out of their own privileged experience, and then sort of diverting when they're called out on that, about like, well, this is a thing that happens, and sort of saying, I'm sorry you had this experience with this one bad person, in a way that diverts from very real issues. Like I have problems with the fact that there's still videos on YouTube about how to bleach your skin for goths, and this sort of, I've heard lots of jokes about like staying out of the sun makes you more goth, and in comic books and from other goths, but that association with whiteness, and the association with vampirism, and the inherent whiteness of vampirism, the hegemony of whiteness, as you said, Trey, and the sort of idea of like white people being able to speak for all of humanity, while black people are black and Asian people are Asian, and that kind of thing.
Yeah. And
I see a lot of that showing up, but it just sort of gets dismissed by white people as like, well, there's a few like shitty people. And I kind of get annoyed sort of with the TikToks I'll see about people just saying, oh, conservatives can't be goth. Because I get that the intent is to say like, hey, goth is supposed to be anti-racist, but if it matters the way you say that, if you're not talking about why that is, or what these value systems are, and why we should be upholding those, then it's just sort of, because there are conservative goths. I've met them. Exactly. I've been around them.
I completely disagree. Like, conservatives can be, anyone can be goth. If someone says they're a goth, they're a goth. Like, people don't tend to use that word, don't tend to use it lightly. If someone's calling themselves a goth, they probably really identify with it, or they're a teenager and they're still working things out. Either way. Mm-hmm. But like, I honestly think that I get that the intention is good, but it's a kind of useless framing to go, oh, conservatives can't be goth, because it's almost like, well, you're just making them not your problem by saying they're not goth.
Yeah.
Instead of,
yes, exactly. Yeah.
By being like, okay, so they're not goth, they're nothing to do with us. And it's like, oh, well, okay, well, they're still going to show up in the club, though. What are you going to do about that? I think that it's kind of almost a way of just kind of, just deflecting responsibility and being like, well, I'm not like them. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah, it does always often come back to, look how good of a person I am, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. I think that because a lot of goths are drawn to the space due to experiences of some kind of marginalization in some form, whether that's, just being bullied at high school or the effects of being trans or anything like that. But it is a space where white people get to be the victim. And I think that's a big part of the resistance when people of color show up and they're like, actually, you guys are in charge of this space. And they're like, what? No, we are...
Yeah.
We're here to feel sad about ourselves. You can't just come in here and tell us we're in charge. Yeah.
I mean, it's actually kind of both, because white people get to play the victim card and get to be victims and get that they can talk about their tragedies of their life and get that kind shoulder and that understanding from their fellow community members, but also they are able to play in that empowered position as the majority, as the people who have the social capital, so they can sort of turn the tide on, in my regular life outside of goth spaces, I am the one bullied and picked on, and now I am the one with all of the power, and I can do the bullying and picked on and picking on. And some people choose not to go down that route, but a lot of people, it's very easy to fall down that route of taking out one's frustration on being bullied by just finding another group that you can inflict that upon to kind of work out your own frustrations. And that is a lot of the core of some of the toxic behavior that can happen in these spaces.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, the trouble is that, like, power dynamics and the recreation of the same toxic social frameworks that you might have escaped can happen in any scene and any subculture. This can happen in just queer spaces, anarchist spaces, goth spaces, anywhere. Yeah. And people need to be so switched on and so self-aware and so reflective to stop those things happening.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's why I have such an issue with this idea of goths trying to be apolitical, because when you have that vacuum, the fascists and the right aren't interested in being apolitical. They aren't interested in playing nice with minorities. And so when you have this, apolitical just basically means like neoliberal, honestly, in my view. And it's just sort of like, well, we have this marketplace of ideas without really even knowing what that means. And all that does is seed ground to hateful rhetoric in our communities. And that's why, like, when goths sort of align with Democrats is my big problem with, like, just, I know this is very American of me, but sort of during the election cycle, the sort of Democrats deciding, well, we're going to be the more moderate version of the racist rhetoric about undocumented migrants instead of having a counter narrative, and which just makes everybody move to the right on those issues. And the, neo-Nazis just further push that association of brown people with violence. Or it was like yesterday or the day before, Biden had this like friendly fireside chat with Trump, which is just like, if you really thought this person was a fascist, you wouldn't be doing this. My therapist recommended this podcast to me. I think it was an NPR podcast. It was called Motive. And they put out this mini series about the history of skinheads and white supremacy, which was interesting because in a bunch of ways, it actually all happened on the south side of Chicago, which I'm just outside of Chicago. But one of the more interesting conclusions of one of the episodes was that, skinheads had previously been anti-racist, and there were only about a dozen, I think, racist skinheads that sort of moved into that area of Chicago. But they were so successful in their rebranding and sort of taking on the sartorial signifiers of punk that they successfully poisoned the well to the point that being a skinhead had no reliable identity. If you were in the scene and you saw somebody who was a skinhead, you no longer knew, is this a safe person or not? You couldn't reliably identify that. And so even though they were eventually kicked out of the scene, that association with white supremacy took over everywhere. And so if we, exactly what you're saying, if we don't have a value system and an education in politics and history and want to try and say, well, it's not really relevant to our scene. Obviously, like, people who are trans or racialized or whatever don't get the privilege of not having their bodies politicized. So I think that is inherently a harmful position to take, and can, in this instance of the skinhead sort of documentary I listened to, can have very real, harmful, lasting consequences.
Yeah, I mean, it completely reshapes the perception of the community.
Sorry, were you going to say something, Chanel?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I wonder if the skinhead, whatever was going on there, I don't know a whole lot about it, but I wonder if that was able to be shifted to the right so easily because the look was already more in line with masculinity, and that being more appealing to the right, whereas goth isn't something that is as likely to go over there in, like, overall. Like, it has issues for sure, but it's generally, like, left leaning, I would say. The issues are more to do with people doing leftism not very good rather than being explicitly right wing. And I do wonder if the aesthetic is just too lipstick.
Yeah, I can definitely see that being a possibility, because you're right. Goth, from an aesthetic point of view, from a just beyond just personal aesthetic, but the aesthetic of the music, the dress, all of that is not in line with a conservative value, a conservative aesthetic around just presentation in society of individuals. It doesn't fit those norms, so it's harder for a conservative to embrace that without having to replace some of those foundational aspects of the subculture, whereas something like the skinhead society did not buck those societal norms for individuals presenting themselves, other than some of the severity, right? Some of the severity around the shaved heads, but that has the militaristic subtext, which again is something that is a pro-conservative value. So it can be viewed that way. So it doesn't require nearly as much cognitive dissonance for someone who has conservative values about society and individual roles in society to exist within that space. You don't need to have that like I said, cognitive dissonance on it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I do think it might have been a bigger issue in the industrial scene for that reason.
Yeah.
Oh, for sure. There was a whole section I didn't get to put in I say a whole section. I started writing a whole section, then I was like, no, this is its own whole video. I can't go into, like, fascism and in the industrial genre. It's like its own whole thing. And maybe I'll do it one day, but because it's fascinating. But
it is, yeah. Oh, yeah. But I mean, there's very good examples there. But I also have seen plenty of white supremacists and, like, Trump supporters or that kind of thing that are in bands or DJs or promoters who usually get called out or sort of protested by other musicians or that sort of thing within goth, but there definitely have been, right-wing conspiracy theorists, that kind of thing. Those people that create music in the scene and aren't really wholly rejected in the sense that I would say, like, maybe a band like Screwdriver in the punk scene would be. They still seem to get away with flying under the radar a bit, even after getting sort of called out for some of their views. And that is frustrating to me and sort of gets back to the point of, I guess, is goth political, or what should the values, or what are the existing political values within goth?
I guess it's going to vary depending on where you are in the world as well, like what the political sphere of your local goth scene tends to be like. I live in a particularly queer city. It's quite white, but it's particularly queer. So I would say the goth scene here definitely leans left, and from the only other nights I've been to are in London, and honestly it seems like the same crowd of people, more or less. There are a few more people of color, but it definitely, very definitely is a left-leaning space as far as the ones I've gone to are. Lots of trans people, lots of people who just don't fit in like, as in you can be trans and right wing. Of course, you can be anything and be right wing, but you're gonna have a hard time explaining like the skirt and everything. So,
I mean, it is interesting because I do think there has been more space allowed for queer or racialized people in, at least in like the American Conservative Party. But if you look at it, they're basically only allowed in the sense that they want them to talk about why Republicans aren't racist or why they aren't homophobic, which that in itself is telling, you know?
Yeah. No, and you often, like, I mean, as in, I'm not as involved in kind of like, I guess, political YouTube as I used to be. I also just don't make as many YouTube videos as I used to because I can't. But I remember what was it? I think it was Ben Shapiro interviewing Blair White. Okay. And it was really sad to see, honestly. Like, I felt for Blair because he's just continuing to misgender her through the whole thing, and she just has to sit there and take it because this is the side she's chosen to be on. And it was horrible.
Yeah. Wouldn't
want to be them. But no, so you can be all those things and be right wing, but it's harder, and I would say that these clubs are predominantly just not appealing to people who are very right wing inclined and stuff. But when it comes to I guess what goth should be politically, I'm not sure I have an opinion on that exactly, because I do personally think that goth is an entirely personal identity. Like, it also because people can you can just identify as goth. You can just do that. Nobody can actually tell you that. The only way that somebody can take that away from you is if you're reliant on the validation of others for that identity. So nobody gets to tell anyone. I mean, people can try. They certainly spend a lot of time trying, but it's ultimately you just don't get to have a say on that. I don't get to have a say on that. No one does. You know, where I was coming from with making that video wasn't even really to say goths should do X, Y, Z. It was more, if you're a person who believes in treating human beings with decency and kindness and respect, and you happen to be in the goth scene, these are things that you might want to think about.
Yeah. I guess, you know, I think you're completely right that it is very fluid and very contingent, that sort of thing. One of the things that sort of sticks with me, though, that I think is generally accepted is this thinking about goth identity through the lens of individualism. I do think that kind of peaked in the 90s, and because there was this sort of rebellion in goth, at least again from my perspective, against what we saw as like a kind of mainstream homogenization of culture. But the 2000s, I think, is when we really fell down that kind of apolitical hole. But I think that idea of the people that I talked to, or if you watch interviews with people of the time and you ask them what is goth, they'll say like goth is being an individual and self-expression. And to me, what that like equates to is this sort of neoliberal ethic of individualism, where it's all about self-reliance, personal responsibility, sort of girl bossing, grind culture, like Jordan Peterson style improvement kind of thing. And the risk there is that it reflects criticism away from systems as any kind of oppressive factor and points it at the individual. Like, I think, Trey, somebody said, pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
I did, yeah.
Like, you aren't disadvantaged because you're black, you're self-sabotaging. And I think this shows up in goth in sort of atomization, which just to, you know, that's the like class warfare tactic of dividing the working class, so that we aren't organized against the actual threat, the actual oppressive powers. But in, you know, Shonalika, what you said earlier about goth nights, I think you were talking about them sort of being run by like one or two people. And I see a lot of that sort of like cemetery meetups or whatever kind of events are usually organized by one to a handful of people and there aren't really a lot of systems in place for collective action. There is a tension that comes up sometimes where people talk about like trying to square the circle of a tension between individualism and community, and sort of there's this quote that I've heard before that is like, we're all individuals but we have the same boots on, kind of pointing to that, like, are we united by a desire for freedom of self-expression, or is there something deeper than that? And I think it's just, it can be harmful in what we're talking about of this, like, if that, it's crazy to me we have to debate if sexism exists in the scene, if racism exists in the scene, and this sort of white people pointing to individuals instead of recognizing or being educated on systemic oppression. And I think that the individualism thing, every person is an island kind of thing, can hinder our ability to organize. So we have a lot of these little, like, kind of mini fiefdoms of scenes that are, you know, and I think that is kind of changing, which is great, but I just think there's a lot of potential to leverage a sort of like non-hierarchical structure to have more agency in the world, more like Trey, you said last episode, alone together. Yeah. And I liked that phrase a lot because we need to focus more on like what we agree on as a community and why we agree on that and what the basis for that is, rather than like a parallel would be the leftism thing of like leftists aren't a united front because we're all arguing about whose vision of society is more ethical, instead of talking about the things we do agree on that are already a problem that we could change, instead of the infighting kind of thing. And that's sort of like the eternal what is goth debate, which I do enjoy talking about, but we sort of skip over real structural problems that seep into our lived experiences because we haven't deconstructed them, we haven't decolonized, at white people specifically, and are sort of reproducing these things in our scene while simultaneously thinking we aren't, because we're all individuals expressing, you know, individuality kind of thing. Sorry, that was really long-winded, but that's just something I've been thinking about recently.
Yeah, no, the individualism is definitely a frustrating aspect of the goth scene to me, or like to, you know, one of the issues I see cropping up in it, because obviously when it comes to freedom of expression, of course, like that's, of course, be as individual as you want. There, that's really important. But that's not the kind of individualism that causes harm to anybody. The kind of individualism that causes harm is, you know, This is such a different topic, but it's vaguely related. I think is like the individualism of the nuclear family. Like here is me. Here are the people who matter, and I will, all of my like care and I will value these people above all other people instead of valuing people in general. Which is not me saying like, okay, we'll treat every single person with exactly the same sort of amount of care, because that would be insane. Like you'd go around just like you wouldn't be able to interact with strangers, but you get thrown in prison. But just that that sense of community, which I find in my personal experience has I've really found that very strongly in the queer community, not the goth scene so much. I love the goth scene, but it's not where my community is. Yeah, I in fact have I have a very specific approach for how I go to goth scenes and how I have a good time there. Maybe I'll come back to that. But the sense of community, not just the sense of, but the practical reality of the community that I have right now is so incredibly strong, and it has taken work to get there. And this isn't just a thing that exists organically in the queer scene. It's something that we have to make happen. And I believe that I have this community, or that I'm part of this community, because I and all the people around me and all the people that they are connected to put that work in, and we reflect, and we make sure to address issues when they come up, and to treat each other with as much care and compassion and kindness as possible, because you just can't afford not to, when there are already so many factors against us that make our lives really difficult. And this has been, I sort of loosely touched on this in the video, but this has been a really, really hellish year for me. This has been like far worse than 2020. This has been one of the worst years of my adult life. In part because of this particularly horrendous experience I had that I mentioned with this white goth at the start of the year, but also, which was a little bit of the push that I needed to make this video. I've been obviously thinking about that video for a long time. Ever since I did the gender and metal video, I was thinking that this would be a logical follow-up, but I hadn't quite had I think that's when I fully was like, this is real. This is a real thing I need to talk about. But also just there's been other problems that aren't anyone's fault that have come up in my community, and that have affected everyone, because basically one person's been in very big trouble, and the entire, like I'm calling it the polycule. It's broader than the polycule. There's people who are not dating who are involved in this, but it's like, it doesn't matter. But like that's like the center of it. Everyone has been pulling their weight to assist this person through this difficult time, and it's been having repercussions on everybody's health, everybody's relationships, and we choose this, even though some of us are not as connected to the person who's having the really hard time as everyone else, because that's what community is, and that's what chosen family is, and that's where my that's where my safety is. That's where my chosen family is as a queer person. And I haven't found that in the goth community at all. I found it in the queer scene, but not in the goth scene.
Oh, yeah, and that is so important. And that's exactly the kind of thing that I wish I saw more of, because I think the potential is there. It just, yeah. I don't, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, I guess in order for that to happen, I guess... It's tricky, because like the circumstances that I described, the kind of network that I just described is not all of the queer scene. It's right. It's very specifically like I've been practicing like I've been practicing working through any behaviors that I do that I'm not as keen on about myself. I've been practicing on doing healthy polyamory. I've been doing all of this for like a decade, and that's not the case with everyone. Not everyone's at the same stage. So there's still like a lot of toxicity that exists just within the queer scenes, exists within leftist scenes, all of this kind of stuff. So then when you abstract that further away from kind of the source where it is expected, because I guess within queer scenes it's maybe slightly more expected that you would be like that than within the goth scene. So then you've got queers within the goth scene, but it's getting more diluted. Do you see what I mean? So I think there is potential because of the types of people that the goth scene tends to attract. But honestly, I think if we're mostly bonding over music and aesthetic there, it's not, the groundwork isn't there to assume anything like this. Honestly, like I have most of my friends are white, because I live in a predominantly white area that is predominantly white people. But of the goths I'm friendly with, almost all of them are people of color. I have like 2 white goth friends. I'm familiar with a whole bunch of white goths. I know many through the scene. I know a bunch of like promoters and DJs and so on and so forth, but like they're all very superficial connections, because I don't trust white goths, honestly, as in not that is impossible to happen. Of course it can, but I'm going to kind of hold all white goths at arm's length until they have shown me that they are deserving of my trust, because I know, especially now, that them just saying that they hold certain values is not the same as practicing them. And And I'm not going to expend my energy falsely, kind of in the assumption that those values are there. If they're not, I will wait for those people to show me that first in their actions.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah. I think a lot of people in my circles have been talking about very similar conclusions they're coming to and the ways that they're going to treat people.
I think one last thing I want to say on that is on a more positive note, is that I was really surprised by the reaction to that video. It was overwhelmingly white folks going, "Oh, this made me uncomfortable, thanks," and
that's fantastic.
And racialized folk going, "Oh, you gave words to my experience. I didn't know I was waiting for this video." That was the vast majority of responses, and I don't think that I would have had this same response had I released this 6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Yeah.
And
I'm really happy to hear that.
my initial sort of explanation, or like the obvious explanation for that would be, well, these people are already in your audience, so of course they're gonna like what you're putting out. But that video has actually mostly not been, or at least at the time that I made this observation, it had predominantly been seen by people who were not familiar with my channel. So I think that suggests that there is something shifting in the culture at large.
Yeah. That's really encouraging.
I'm just looking at the view count on it right now, and it's a significantly greater view count than most of the other videos you made around the same time.
Yeah, very surprising. It's so niche. It's so niche.
Sorry about my dogs. My doorbell was assaulted by Christians, and my wife is out there arguing with them. So I think they're going to be barking for a little bit. The other portion, I guess the beginning portion primarily of that video, was about music, and I have some thoughts about that, so I thought we could have a little quick version of trying to ask some questions to understand where you're coming from. So I guess my first question would be around the framing of this, which is sort of how you interpret the phrase goth is a music-based subculture, because I think that one sentence is doing a lot of work. So when you hear that, like, what does that mean to you? What is that implying?
I think the intention with it is no bad thing, right? I think the intention is actually, it doesn't matter what you look like. You don't have to have a certain aesthetic. If you're into the music, then you're in with us, right? I think that's nice. But firstly, that's not how it works, because were that the case, I would have been recognized as goth a hell of a lot longer than a long time before I actually was. I had to very much start doing the aesthetic before anybody, well, apart from my partner, because they're wonderful. But otherwise it just didn't happen. So it's a nice idea, but it's not practically true. If you want to be really nitpicky, in that video, I do just straight up say goth is not a music-based subculture, which, if you want to be really nitpicky, what I should have said is goth is not a music-based identity.
Okay.
You can identify into goth whoever, and for whatever reason. You can literally be, have no goth traits whatsoever and call yourself goth, and then I guess you're a goth. I don't know why you'd do that, but you could, in theory. As the subculture is still quite heavily music-based, but that really just doesn't cover it. I think that the aesthetic and sensibility are very heavily entwined in terms of... Because if you're going to say it's a music-based subculture, a lot of the music is so divergent that what is actually uniting all that music is something that isn't musical. It's more to do with aesthetic and sensibility. So I'd say that those factors are at least equally important in codifying the subculture. If not, do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I do. I think there's two topics in there that I kind of want to talk about. I think the phrase is interesting to me, just to sort of explain where I perceive it coming from, is out of the early to mid 2010s, when at the time a lot of the media online was either fashion hauls, makeup tutorials, unboxings, that kind of thing. And so people who frequented clubs or were a bit older were voicing that they were worried about goth being reduced to this idea that it was just a visual fashion thing. And so there was this push to try and talk more about like, what does identity mean? What's the history of the goth scene? And have a more robust discussion. And that sort of got boiled down into goth is, and this was also before the like post-punk explosion and the dark wave explosion that happened after that. And there wasn't a lot of goth music being produced. And I think people worried that that was going to sort of kill the scene in a way. I don't agree with the idea that all you need to do to be goth is to listen to goth music. I like my perspective, which maybe I can get into in a little bit, is it's more than that. It's not a single thing. Well, it might be helpful to explain. So I think like I do like the idea of music as a focus because from my perspective, music has this coming together of all these parts of goth. You have the sound and the vibe and the atmosphere of the music. You have the fashion and the artistic expression. You have the sort of the macabre and the uncanny filter that sometimes gets like associated with gothic literature. And that kind of like finding beauty in the darkness kind of thing. There's the camp aspects of goth, and then you get the community coming together aspect, and like sort of active participation part of that, and active self-identification. That for me is what I think goth is all of these sort of components being coming together in a like ever-shifting, evolving configurations. So maybe you can explain a little bit about the first thing you mentioned. I think is sort of the way that goth music is amorphous as a category. I know you talked a lot about that in the video, but if you talk about that a little bit and why it's like not a good taxonomy for like a genre.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, because within goth spaces, like if you go to like the alternative club and then it's like, this is the sort of dark wave room, this is the goth room, this is the EBM room or something, then you kind of know what those different things, and the word goth there works to differentiate something from something else. But you still call that the goth club. And all of those genres fall under the broader category of goth music, I would say, as in music that goths like. Yeah, sorry, I've forgotten the question.
Yeah, well, just like the idea of goth as a genre being too amorphous. I think you kind of answered that. Like, it's just things that goths like. We kind of had this discussion with Natasha Scharf previously about goth music as an umbrella, and this sort of argument about, well, what is under the umbrella? How wide is that? Like, are you including metal and EBM? Are those genres too distinct? You know, this idea of like goth music is what goths like. I feel like it can become too diluted. Like, I'm not against the fluidity of. One of the things I love about goth music is that it has kept that spirit of the 80s with this focus of like just creating art for the sake of art, without trying to fit a specific stereotype. But I think I have a little trouble with the idea of it's what goths like, because then it just sort of pushes the question to like, what do goths like? What are goths then, to sort of understand?
Yeah,
what
it's a circular thing. And it's very similar to the thing we complained about when we did the book review, where the criteria with goth was, well, goth music is what's on a goth club playlist.
Yeah, I think like the main criticism online is this sort of concern about goth can then be anything. And like, I'm not even necessarily opposed to the idea that goth can be anything, because I do think goth can be anything. I don't think it is everything all at the same time, though, which is maybe the distinction there.
I think I definitely fall more into the goth can be anything category. Doesn't mean it like you say, it doesn't mean it's everything.
Yeah.
But I think I fall more, partly just because it's like these discussions are fun.
Yeah.
But they're not sort of fundamentally important in the same way as like kind of what we were talking about, like with values and ethics earlier.
Yes.
So like it's fun, but it's not actually that important at the end of the day. I don't even know if I have a complete thought on this, but it was just kind of what was occurring to me as you were speaking, is that if you take metal, that's a genre a lot of goths like, but it's typically not classed as goth, with the exception of very specific bands that are kind of doing gothic metal, right?
Yeah, it's very rarely included.
And it's very rarely played in clubs. But then you take industrial, and that is quite frequently played in clubs, and would fall under goth music a lot of the time, to me, even though that does sometimes then cross over into metal and stuff. But then there's also a side of it which crosses over more into EBM, and that's very solidly, neatly played in clubs category. So I was trying to think, because initially I was like, oh, what's the distinction between like metal and a lot of goth music? Is it that metal leans too hard on aggression instead of melancholy? And that could maybe be part of it, but then I was like, oh, but what about industrial? Because that's quite aggressive. I think maybe if it's, I'm just thinking here pretty much about like what gets it played in a club. I think if it's aggressive, it has to be danceable, and that's maybe what qualifies it for the goth club. Whereas, but I don't know. I think also a lot of goths, like, it's just sort of guitar allergy.
Yeah,
it's like that makes it. Oh, I think maybe
the only counterpoint I'd have to the guitar allergy aspect is the prevalence of punk and punk coded music within the goth scene.
The post punk stuff is always very guitar heavy, but it's all like washy guitar rather than distorted guitar. Yeah, it's just almost like a different instrument in terms of what it's doing musically. I don't really. Who knows? It is a mystery.
I mean, sorry, go ahead.
No, I think maybe the only other thing that I was going to touch on as a possible factor is artificiality, which again shifts away from the post-punk thing, which is all quite like real instruments, but a distinction between industrial and metal is often that the heavy reliance on like drum machines and synthesizers in industrial, and the presence of real instruments in metal, and one making industrial more suitable for clubs than the other. But again, that doesn't track with the post-punk thing. So yeah, no idea. But it's interesting.
Well, Trey, I'm sure you probably have a thought. I just pulled up, I mentioned this last episode, but a friend of mine, KB, who has the YouTube channel Goth Music Latin America, I had to pull up I pulled a quote out of their video recently where they defined goth music as consistent minor keys, dissonant chords, strong bass lines, jangly guitars, spooky synth, and discordant sounds that create unease, which is generally a similar thing I hear from people when I ask them that question, also including like a sense of melancholy or dour bittersweetness. I don't know how you feel about that as a sort of classification metric, I guess.
I love that definition. I think that's pretty good. Yeah,
it's good. It's a little bit, I want to say it's a little bit hand wavy. There's a lot in there that's still not. Yeah. I mean, it's obviously not like clearly defined. This is not a musicological, rigorously musicological definition, and it also, and I'd say rightly so, pretty much completely excludes industrial, because industrial doesn't fit that categorization. But I also don't view industrial as underneath the goth umbrella, partly because when it comes to the club play stuff, at least in my inception when I started going to goth clubs, when industrial was played, the club was called a goth industrial club. When I went to a club that just said they were goth.
Men were meant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, there usually was that distinction. They usually had both terms in it, and that is what was sort of defining it and why those two genres were allowed to cohabitate. And frequently the population in those clubs was also to some degree segregated. There was always crossover because, as you mentioned, and rightly so, Shonalika, goths do like a lot of music that even they would say, this isn't goth, but I like it. And oftentimes industrial and metal are two big ones. Sometimes punk. Punk is, I think, more of a gray area in there just because of the relationship with punk to post-punk and the inception of goth, though there are plenty of good arguments that industrial had its origin in the post-punk scene as well, because Robin Gristle and bands like that were also at the beginning considered post-punk in the 70s. So distinguishing that, I mean, post-punk nowadays has become sort of an actual genre classification that is music that sounds like Joy Division. But in the original sense, it was really just an overarching concept of a reaction against the sort of restrictions and conservative nature of punk in the 70s and what was considered okay to be punk. So it was a very broad generalization of music, not a codified genre, where it's become a little more codified at this point. And I think the lack of structure in goth as a genre, which I kind of view goth in the same sense I view post-punk in its origin, in that it is more of a general category of musics rather than an explicit genre. And I think part of that is something it inherited from that origin under post-punk, is this experiment with lots of sounds, and there is an underlying musical aesthetic, as evidenced by what Danny read from the Latin goth scene definition of goth, is that sort of general sense, which, like I said, is hand wavy and not very specific, but I don't think that's a bad thing. That's a good thing that allows it to be this broad umbrella of musics that lets it encompass things I like. But there are definitely, I mean, I love all kinds of music personally, and I have no bones about liking music that is not goth. That's fine. I think the idea that to be a goth is a proscriptive thing is problematic in and of itself.
Oh yeah, that's rubbish.
Yeah. But there is to some degree of value of having a sense of where sort of the boundaries of that gothic umbrella are, to some degree, partly because it comes down to what I view the value of genre is. And genre to me is its value is in discovery, music discovery. I like this music. I want to find other things like this music. Having something that it's called and that you can use to find similar things with similar sonic characteristics is the whole important value of genre to me. And why I don't necessarily have a problem when a band that was goth or was metal moves into jazz or moves into something else. It's not an affront to me. I may not like the direction they went, but it's like, that's fine. I'll find other music that fits it. So that's sort of my idea toward genre. And why I also agree to some degree that having this idea of the music-based subculture, to go back to the original point of the discussion, is problematic when it comes to goth if it is viewed as that and only that.
At the end of the day, there are just too many facts. Like we could have this discussion forever and not arrive at a conclusion that all of us agree on as to
as
what
a community we
is.
have been.
Yeah, literally. So I think, honestly, like, I mean, the fact, like, Trey, your understanding of goth music doesn't include industrial, and mine typically does include industrial, but typically doesn't include metal, which is where I sit most of the time.
Yeah,
that has no practical, real world effect. It doesn't. It doesn't matter in the slightest. If goth clubs can get around, if people are being nitpicky about the genres they're using, they can call the club alternative and then play whatever the hell they want.
Right. Yep.
So yeah, I think I enjoy that goth is nebulous. I enjoy that its parameters are constantly shifting and it's constantly evolving, and it's just not important what the definition, because I think the definition is going to vary to every individual what they consider goth, and it's that relates back to goth being a very personal, identity-based thing. And I think everyone can have their own parameters, and that's fine. But where I think it's important to not necessarily go around calling all sorts of things goth, but to be able to see the gothic in places that you wouldn't normally expect it, helps to get around the issues of gatekeeping, connecting with issues of race. Basically, because you will often, I think black artists in particular are more likely to be pigeon. I mean, well, a thing recently happened, and I can't remember this because this is a kind of secondhand anecdote from my housemate who listens to more Tyler the Creator than I do. But it was for one of his albums, either the most recent one or a one before it, and
I think it's the one before it.
Right, yeah, it got nominated in like the best hip hop album category for some award, and I think he went up and he said, "This is not a hip hop album. You've just said that this is a hip hop album because I'm black. This is like an industrial album," and or an album with like very, very heavy industrial influences, and people just weren't able to hear that because they're like, "Well, you're a rapper, so everything you make is rap." And and there's a very sort of heavy racial element to that, and that's not the be all and end all of gatekeeping, but it's definitely one aspect to it. And it's definitely one aspect that I found frustrating, because when I first started making music that was spooky, it was much more in like a dark trap direction than the more like EBM-y direction that I'm going in now. And I think that put a lot of people off.
Yeah, I think it was the Igor album, I believe, is the one that probably got that. Yes, I think that's what you're
talking about. Yeah.
Two points there. I think first, actually, you might have, somebody mentioned this, I think, in your video with Vlad, the fact that in the goth scene, if you are racialized, there are more sort of purity tests, and you have like less freedom aesthetically. For example, you have to, you should normally will like dress more traditionally goth, whereas if a white goth experimented outside of that, it could still get away with like being called a goth look, whereas if a racialized person did, you're more like you're a poser kind of thing.
Yeah, and I definitely play with that privilege.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the funny thing is that in my experience among like the racialized goths that I know, I actually see the opposite thing happening with. I mean, you've seen Vlad, you've seen what they look like.
Yeah,
not that they're not that they're an example of
Incredible.
Like what all racialized. Yeah,
That's
right.
I mean, they express in the video itself that they dress like they want, and they don't care about the genre classifications it's under. It's just them.
It's because which is true, and I'm really glad that they got to that stage. And I'd say like I think I feel similarly now, but in part that happens. I've noticed more racialized folk kind of being more creative with the way they look because you can't just wear the right clothes and instantly be seen as goth. You can go down one of two routes. You can either like try really hard to get that validation, or you can throw that validation out the window and be like, well, I'm not going to be recognized anyway, so I'm going to be a teddy bear if you're Vlad, or just do whatever you want if you're someone else.
Yeah, the idea of
the alt to teddy bear pipeline. Yeah.
Yeah, if I put all the effort and work into it and you still don't give me the time of day, fuck it, I'll do whatever I want. I'm not going to play by your rules anymore.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think when it comes to making music, for me, I kind of just make whatever I want. And I mean, well, especially I just wrote a song in Tokipona, which is it's about as niche and obscure as you could possibly get. I think that's partly because I'm not looking at music. I'm not even remotely trying to make music a career. I think I tried that for 1 month and it made me so miserable, and then I ditched it and was like, I never want to do this. This is killing it for me. I like, as in I will put out the stuff that I want to make, and if it gets traction and if opportunities come up, fantastic, but I'm not going to go seeking them out because the process is so bleak and so rubbish that it just ends up killing the thing I love, and I love it too much for that to happen.
Yeah, that industry is becoming more and more fraught as well with all the changes that are happening in it.
One of the other things you said that I loved, something I agree with, is that there are basically as many definitions of goth as there are goths. And I think, I guess the way that I understand that meaning, the way we make meaning and boundaries of a culture or a concept are contingent on actions and relationships of the people or the agents involved in that. So for a concept to have meaning, there are temporal, like immediate, like you were talking about, sort of location matters, interactive networks of people and things that bring forth the value of that thing, which makes goth fluid, because what goth is for the three of us right now will be different than a group of people at like a club in Mexico or something. It's this emergent entity co-created by the agents involved in a spatial temporary setting, with these like bundles of practices and material arrangements. And so when we start identifying like what is taboo for goth or what is not goth, it varies, because the practices and understandings and rules of the participants in any given setting across time as well, and space and place is variable. So what's goth for us could be anathema to someone else, but that it's still, I think both of those are valid for those people and at those times. And that's why I like music as well, just the way that the goth community understands music, as you were saying, as this sort of like everything is negotiable. The canon is negotiable. You talked about that in the video as well. Like for everyone who says The Cure is a goth band, there's someone who says The Cure is not a goth band, and et cetera, and so on and so forth. And so getting to the idea underneath that of these things are variable and show up in different configurations and change over time, rather than I'm very like opposed to essentialism and this idea that goth or identity is one thing forever, reducible to an essence across time forever. So that's something I really do appreciate about goth, and I think that comes out in the artistic expression of it.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, as I said this in the video as well, but like I really the gatekeeping tendencies of some goths, I think I notice much more online than in real life. I don't think in real life anyone cares anywhere near half as much as that. I mean, this might sound like an extreme thing to say, but I do think one thing that I didn't touch on in the video so much is that those tendencies, if policing the boundaries of the genre is something that you care about very much, that's a kind of I can't say this, fascistic. Yeah, fascistic. There we go. Yeah. Way of thinking, where it's like, well, this is the pure thing, and any deviance from that must be punished, and it doesn't benefit anyone, because eventually then you're just going to be concerned with staying in this very pure bracket and not falling outside of it. And I just think people need to, I'm not saying that everyone who like is a genre purist is a fascist, but like just that's the kind of thought pattern that is analogous to. And the more we can break away from rigid definitions in general, the better, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and to your point, I find that discussion about music and what is goth a fun thing, but it is not the most important thing, right? Because, culture is this emergent, dynamic expression of community. There shouldn't be a singular understanding or embodiment of that, I guess. And that's part of why I don't agree with the goth is a single thing. Like, goth is not just music. I think that's necessary but not sufficient to explain that in these sort of like bundles of ways of being, I guess. Yeah. I have a friend who isn't even interested in the music at all, and I identifies as goth, which I always find super interesting, and so I like will like reference her at every available opportunity. But this woman is an ex-funeral director who spent a lot of time around dead bodies, and nobody can tell her she's not goth. Yeah, no, I have a friend like that as well. So actually.
I don't understand. I find it very like, I'm like, I don't understand how you can be you and have such gothic sensibilities and no interest in the music whatsoever. Yeah. Like that's bonkers to me. But it's a real thing. It can happen.
I think one of the interesting things as well is the idea of sort of founders of the goth genre rejecting the term goth.
It would have meant something different at the time.
I mean, there's also, were they founders by their choice, or were they
that's the thing,
founders by designation by other people? And that's the problem.
That's the fluidity thing, and you all, because like you do have Andy Sexgang wrote a foreword to a book, I don't remember which book, talking about why he loves goth. And I remember Wayne Hussey, in response to Peter Murphy saying he hated being called the father of goths, was like, I'll be the father of goth, that's fine with me. And so, yeah, it is this weird, and like, yeah, to your point, Trey, it's sort of like you have the musicians and you have the music fans, and like some of the music fans were on board with using labels to identify themselves, gothic goblins or whatever, cure heads, that kind of thing.
I mean, music fans are usually much more rapid to, yeah, I know, gothic goblins.
Yeah.
But fandom is much more prone, I think, to glomming onto an identity rather than creators. Creators don't like to glom onto an identity because that's a sense of restriction. And sometimes restriction is nice for creativity purposes, but in general, the idea that I have to do this because that's the way I've been pigeonholed by something I did in the past is very frustrating to an individual who's creative, but it's very comforting to someone who's looking for a sense of community and identity, especially if they're still at a point in their life where they're externalizing their identity and don't have a good solid concept of what they are from an internalized standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've noticed that not that many musicians will refer to themselves as goth, and it's the fans and the reviewers who decide. But also I think it's for the fans and reviewers to decide what genre a band is. The band just make the art.
Right. Well, I mean, art is always a dialogue between the artist and the consumer of the art. I'm not a big fan of the idea of, what the artist thinks the art is the end all be all of what the art is. I do have one thought I wanted to mention that we kind of touched on a couple of times in tangential mains, but I think there's a tension between the idea of goth as an identity, an individualistic identity, and goth as a communal identity. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where some of the gatekeeping comes in and where some of that tension comes in. Because to Shonalika's point, nobody can police another person's individual identity. You can say you are whatever you are, and that's just what you are. Mm-hmm. There's nothing that you can say to that. And you shouldn't, because that's thought policing and back into that fascistic thing where everybody needs to be put in their place and everybody needs to be in their little box. And that's a control over individual freedoms. And that is at least viewed as a problem from our individualistic Western society point of view. However, when it comes to community identity, when it comes to joining together with people, there is a sense that consensus is necessary just for group cohesion. Now, whether that's a very strict consensus, a very strictly regimented idea of you have to be exactly this to be part of a community versus another is always a debate that I think any community has. Regardless of the community, there's always a sense of, well, how fuzzy can we make the edges and still have that sense of communal being? Because you'll always have this idea that someone comes into the community and if they don't have any similar interests, what are they adding to the community? What do they get from the community, which is always the question, but what does the community get from them? There's this collaborative aspect of community that a healthy community is building one another up. And if they don't share something in common other than beyond just a name, does that really function as a way for that community to self-support? And I think that's some of where the gatekeeping comes in. And there's always also just the counterexamples where you have something like, as you already mentioned, Danny, with the skinhead population, that was a community that had an identity, but apparently it wasn't rigid enough, or they let it slip enough that an external force was able to come in, completely reshape that identity. And while there are certainly people who still have skinhead communities that adhere to the original concept of the community, the problem is the greater understanding of that community has been completely tarred as racist white supremacists. So you can no longer, it kind of forces people who are in that community to go into the closet, to use a term from queer spaces, or to be tarred with a preconception by those around them who aren't part of that community of who they are and what they are, that was no longer part of the narrative that they had any control over. And that is a risk that can happen to community, and happens to many communities that are targeted, especially communities that are, subcultural or that are alternative. They're definitely minority communities. It's a very fragile existence where you're trying to exist in the world, but it's hard to exist in a world when people have gross misunderstandings about what your membership of that community actually means. And that's something that queer communities have had to fight against. That's something that pagan communities fight against. That's something that goth communities fight against, metal communities fight against. All these communities that are, minority communities, they are communities that are outside of the quote unquote mainstream. But still we have to exist in a world that does have the mainstream, even though, that's not a thing, but that has a concept-ish of a mainstream that differentiates and comments upon these other elements of the world they're in. So I think that's where a lot of the gatekeeping comes from, is just this fear that the community you value and the community you want to stay within and support it is going to be even more demonized by those external forces because somebody is let into the community who has a lack of whatever the sort of ethical, moral boundaries that you want to have as a foundation, as we were talking on early, when we were talking about the politicalization of goth. What is that moral and ethical foundation that can be actionable and important within a community? And what happens if that gets eroded by people who are coming in claiming to be part of that community and loudly proclaiming it in public, and how that colors the perception of the community within people who are outside of that community.
I think the way to deal with that in general, focus on combating the behaviors that you don't want to see in that community, and leading by being an example of the behaviors that you do want to see.
Yes.
Rather than saying, well, that behavior isn't an example of our community.
Yes.
Right. But is that not gatekeeping?
I wouldn't say so. So
No?
say for example, here's a rhetorical question that gets thrown around as part of I'm not sure what the right word is, in an attempt to undermine trans rights and stuff.
Yeah.
It's often like, okay, so the bathroom debate, right? So what if a trans woman assaults someone in a bathroom, right? What if that happens? Then what? Like, and it's like, okay, well then
the thing that's
that
never
person
happened.
is but like, let's just say, because you have to go, because also that could happen. There are awful trans people who exist in the world. That's absolutely something that could happen. I don't think it's terribly likely, but it's totally feasible, right? In theory. And that means, like, I'm sure cis women have assaulted people in bathrooms before.
Right, I was going to make that exact same point. The exact same should happen if a cis woman assaults someone in a bathroom.
So then what you do is you don't say this person's pretending to be trans. You don't say that she's not one of us. You're like, that person did a bad behavior, and we are going to deal with that individual bad behavior. It's not representative of all trans people, but we're not going to say she's not trans because she hasn't acted in line with our values, because she is trans. She says she is.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's that idea of less gatekeeping and more enacting what you want to happen in the world. And as you put into action those behaviors, you are necessarily reducing and promoting a way of being in the world. And it's less about other people must follow these guidelines and more about living out those values, I guess.
Yeah, that's what I think anyway.
I still categorize it under gatekeep. I think it's important to gatekeep behavior that affects other people, but it's not important to gatekeep opinion.
I think that's making the definition of gatekeeping really broad then, though. No, I just mean, like, I think that's maybe our understandings of the word gatekeeping is different. Because to me, that's
I'm sure
like,
it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Because to me, I would say that's like gatekeeping usually applies to like who can or can't be part of an identity, rather than just like, well, this is a shitty behavior and we're going to call you out on it. I wouldn't say that like if someone assaults someone in a nightclub and then you throw them out the nightclub, I wouldn't say that's gatekeeping. Even though, funnily enough, that's literal gatekeeping. It's like, we're not letting you back in the club.
Right.
But that's not usually how the term gatekeeping is used.
Correct.
At least in my experience.
Yeah, I mean, and that's fair. That's just where my only stance is on the idea of quote unquote gatekeeping based on my definition, which is more that literal defending the gates, defending the boundaries.
Right. If that's your definition,
something.
then I agree.
And
yeah.
It generally is, but I understand the difference between that literal definition and the understood colloquial definition that is usually addressed. And there definitely, I mean, there needs to be, I mean, that's always the problem with having these discussions is when people have different definitions for the same word. And that it's very good that we kind of got that out there because that makes this conversation possible. But yeah, I think back to what we were talking about early on, the important core things that need to be discussed around the development and preservation of community is around what is and is not okay behavior, interactions with other people, ethical, moral boundaries. It's not so much about personal choices and aesthetic and what music do you like, what do you like to wear. Those are nice and those are important signifiers of, hey, how do you recognize somebody in and out? But those are the superficial things, right? Those are the things that are easy to fake. So a true community needs to be able to dig deeper than that. Sure, those initial signifiers are important for, community membership signification.
Yeah.
But
I think
if you just stop there, it's not a foundation for a healthy community.
Yeah, no, I think for a lot of people that those signifiers they're not even fake. Like, I think a lot of people genuinely have aspirations towards, like, the values that they claim to hold and stuff. It's just that they're just not doing a good enough job of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Back to the say but not doing thing.
Yeah, exactly.
But there was also there's a period where there was a lot of frustration, especially when goth aesthetic became such a meme around just the rise of Pinterest and Instagram and TikTok and that aesthetic, where people would be frustrating because they got used to an environment pre-internet where if you go out in public and you see somebody wearing a Joy Division shirt or with a certain aesthetic, you can make assumptions about them and are generally pretty accurate. So you can strike up that conversation and immediately start finding that common ground. And they were finding that those assumptions were no longer safe anymore. And they would approach someone who looked alternative on the bus or whatever and start talking about something that was important to them, and the person would look at them as if they grew a second head. But I have no interest in that. I just like this shirt or I just like this aesthetic. And I think a lot of people were sort of blindsided by that societal change, this idea that people started showing the visual signifiers, and it is usually a visual signifier of membership of a community, but then when approached as if, oh, you're a common soul, let's connect, and you get this sort of slap in the face of, nope, I have nothing in common with you other than I like to look this way. And that, I think that blindsided a lot of people and caused a bit of an overreaction in the other direction.
Yeah.
That explains a lot. It must have been frustrating. It's I do think things the shifts like that are inevitable, but yeah, hard to deal with sometimes. Yeah.
Well, so to wrap up, I'm really honored and appreciative to have been allowed your time and your thoughts. This has been a really enlightening and engaging discussion. So first of all, I want to say that thank you so much for hanging out with us. As we wrap up here, Shonalika, like I mentioned, I will have links to everything in the show notes so people can find you those, like your link tree and that kind of thing. Is there anywhere specific you would like to send people to take a look at your artistry.
I think the link tree is good. I do need to update it actually, but I think the link tree is a very solid place to send people. I suppose I want to specifically mention my my synth pop duo Powderpaint, which is not active right now, but on the subject of like genres that aren't goth, but a lot of goths are into.
Yep.
That one, I think a lot of people who might listen to this podcast may appreciate that music, and it's not because it's not what I'm doing right now. People may not find it as easily as if they just are looking for me, I guess. So that's something I wanted to specifically mention. Other than that, not really. I had a really good time chatting with you both. It's very much having these kinds of discussions and talking to the kinds of people who see me saying the things I say on YouTube and whose response is, yeah, I'm going to lean in and bring that person onto the show so that they can say more. Is definitely the kind of person I want to be talking to in the goth community. So yeah, it's been really nice for me.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Great.
Really appreciate that.
And to go on tangents here real quick, this is not a digression of sorts, but Shonalika, I just want to thank you for your book review videos. I've been enjoying those.
Nice.
I mean, this wasn't one you introduced me to, but it was what made me think, oh, Shonalika has something interesting to say. But I'm a huge fan of the Murderbot Diaries.
Oh my God, they're so good, right?
So I loved them. I loved them so much. And the funny thing is, I listen to mostly audiobooks just because I'm lazy and don't find myself having time or don't find myself making time to sit down and actually read. It's much easier for me to do it with other things. But I wasn't able to find an audiobook of the Murderbot Diaries. But what worked really well is I found... I did not. No, that would be kind of fun. But
also then you'd have to read the book.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. I'm actually not a bad reader, but because the narrator is an AI robot, it works really well to download an ebook and use an AI reader.
Fantastic. Yeah.
On Google Books. So I listened to it read to me by the Google AI voice, and it worked very, very well.
That adds
brilliant.
Meta existential dread to your consumption of that. Yeah.
So yeah, I did enjoy that. But I've read, I mean, I'm starting to try to grab some of the ones you've mentioned, but other ones that I've enjoyed, the TJ Klune Under the Whispering Door.
Oh, you like that one?
I had similar mixed responses that you did. I enjoyed it. I've read a few TJ Klune books, and I'm very mixed on them, just in general. And then, I mean, you read Good Omens. I'm a huge Terry Pratchett fan.
Yeah.
And that's my main touchstone with Good Omens. I know Neil Gaiman, of course, has had a bit of a downfall in the last few months.
Oh, I don't know anything about it. I've never liked Neil Gaiman.
That's fair. He's gotten, like a lot of famous men do, things got unearthed about questionable interactions.
It doesn't surprise me, honestly. I can kind of smell it in his books. It's got an odor.
Yeah, right. And I need to look it up. There was a book I was going to recommend you that I thought I really enjoyed because it touches on both the trans experience and musician experience.
No, I'm really, because the book review videos are obviously among my least viewed videos.
Yeah.
So it's really, but I like doing them, and also especially because although they're the videos that kind of get the least attention from people I don't know, they're probably the videos that get the most attention from my friends. They'll always come to me and be like, oh, I read this one on your recommendation, or oh, can you review this one in next year or whatever. And for some reason they just connect to people I actually know more. But yeah, so it's really nice for me to hear like that other people are enjoying them as well.
Yeah, so I'm trying to pull up my history I got it from the library. So where was it? I think it's this one.
Yeah, unfortunately. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, it's called Light from Uncommon Stars.
Stars. Is it science fiction?
It is. Yes, it kind of mixes things, but the author is Rika Ryka Aoki Aoki, who is trans, one, and also a part of the Asian community in California. So a little bit of that. I want to say just immigrant community, I guess, within. I think they're a second generation immigrant, so still raised amongst families that a family that still held to some of the core beliefs of the home culture. So it has a lot of things going on with it. So there's a bit of the Faust's tale, because there's the whole idea of selling your soul. So one of the main characters is an agent of Satan, who is collecting performers and trying to basically teach and bring up great performances so they can then be given, their soul can be given over. But there's also aliens who are on the run from their own people and are in Earth that are sort of their own little tangent. It's just, there's a lot of things, a lot of the critiques around it oftentimes talk about how it being just kind of, it's too many different things at once, but I kind of embraced that a lot.
Yeah.
But I think it was very interesting. I thought the trans experience was fairly well established. Ideas of body dysmorphia were very key aspects of it. And also the misunderstanding between people who do not have body dysmorphia and may aspire to or may feel that certain things are an advantage that someone with body dysmorphia doesn't agree with. Like some aspect of, oh, you have this masculine trait, but you don't like masculinity, but it's an advantage in this way, but still you hate it, even though you want to be part of that thing that it would be considered an advantage in. But because you have the dysmorphic aspect of it there, you don't want to embrace that, even if it would be an advantage to you in your chosen activity.
You're talking about.
So it deals with a lot of that.
Yeah.
I thought it was a fascinating book. I really did enjoy it.
If it falls enough into the sci-fi genre, then I could suggest it and do it on my podcast with Adam.
It definitely does. There's definitely some sci-fi aspects. I mean, it takes place in the real world. It's not galaxy far, far away or future. It's definitely modern times, modern day California, but there are aliens there. There is alien technology there. There is the fact, the sort of more fantasy rather than sci-fi fact that, Satan, or hell exists. They are harvesting souls. There are agents of Satan on the earth that are interacting. So it's a mix of a lot of those things in sort of also a real world setting. So,
wonderful.
Yeah.
It's on, it looks like my library app has it as well, so I might get the audiobook.
Yeah, I got it from Libby, from our local, from the Chicago library.
Thank you again so much for your time. That was a fantastic episode and a great way to end the year, I think. Speaking of ending the year, I already have ideas for episodes for next year, and I cannot wait to get to creating new content for 2025. If you missed it last episode, it's worth mentioning that there will be no episode in January. We'll be taking our yearly hiatus. However, for everyone who is a member on Patreon, you will be invited to our annual Patreon Zoom hangout in lieu of a episode that month. Trey and I always have a lovely time chatting with everyone for a few hours, so I hope that you will be able to join us then. Look to Patreon in a few weeks for a link to that. And then in February, we will be returning to have Andre from Wave of Things on to talk about all things goth music. I will say, though, in a completely oblique and vague manner, that between now and February, there very well may be a new goth podcast launching on the Belfry to sate your appetite in the meantime. I won't say anything more than that, but I am incredibly excited to share more with you when I can. Speaking of Patreon, though, I did mention last episode that for the last few months, both myself and my wife have been out of work. My wife is no longer able to work due to various disabilities. And myself, the company I worked for went bankrupt and fired everyone. And I have not yet been able to find a new job. And so we are definitely struggling. I won't go into more detail than that. But anyone who is able to jump on Patreon, even for just $1 a month, that will get you access to our Discord and our Patreon hangout in January. And I would like to thank everyone who continues to support us on Patreon. It's literally feeding my family right now, And that is a blessing that I do not take for granted. But that is going to conclude our episode. I genuinely hope that you find some rest during the holiday season as it is, that you get to spend some time with those that you love, and put aside the stress of everything happening in the world right now for just a little while. If you enjoy snow like I do, I hope you have many cozy nights looking at the snow falling, and I genuinely wish you all my best. So until next time, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.